While most of the world is obsessed with the new, Namibia is all about the old. Here the desert is so ancient that it was already forming, while the last dinosaurs were still roaming the earth. On top of that, the first local art was etched into stone 27,000 years ago. And the most fashionable dresses on the street are a colourful defiance of 19th century Victorian garb. But I'm just getting started. If you're curious to see what else makes this country so interesting, keep watching. So, the first Namibians were known as the San, or the Bushmen. They were hunter-gatherers who had been reading this land like a book for over 20,000 years. Of course, at the time, there were no permanent settlements or borders yet, which meant they had to rely on their knowledge of the environment, but as much as they were learning from nature, they were also trying to leave their own mark on it. Literally. For example, in the south, in the Apollo 11 cave, archaeologists found stones painted with animals dating back 27,500 years. That's older than the pyramids, older than almost all of recorded human history. And at Tweefelfontein in the northwest, there were thousands of incredible engravings that depict a world where humans and wildlife were one. Then, around the 14th century, Bantu-speaking people began arriving from Central Africa. One of them was the Ovahumbo. They settled in the north and built actual kingdoms on both sides of the Kunini River. Another was the Herero. They, on the other hand, spread across the central and northeastern regions and built interlocked clan systems around cattle. In the south, that's where you'll meet the Nahmu, then the Dukhmahru, the Kuvahungo, the Rehoboth Bustus. Yeah, you get the drill. Each group carved out its world, so yes, it was complex, and yes, it was not always peaceful. But the important thing is, it was theirs. Then 1883 happened. During this time, a German merchant named Adolf Luderitz sailed to the southern coast and negotiated a land deal with a local Nahmu chief. Take note, I'm using the word negotiated quite loosely here, because the contract was actually written so that the measurements were in different units, depending on which version you read. See, the chief thought he was selling a small coastal strip only. Turns out he signed away a massive territory, and that's how it all started. By 1884, following the Berlin Conference, where European powers sat around a table and divided up Africa without a single African in the room, the territory we know as Namibia now became German Southwest Africa. And Germany started taking land, building railways, extracting resources, and suppressing anyone who pushed back. It was the beginning of colonization. But in 1904, the Herero pushed back. So let me tell you what happened. German General Lothar von Trothu defeated the main Herero army at the Battle of Waterberg. You'd think he'd do his victory lap, right? But he didn't stop there. He actually issued an extermination order, meaning every Herero found in German-controlled territory was to be shot. Those who fled into the Kalahari would die of thirst and starvation. Then, those who were captured were sent to concentration camps on Shark Island, among other locations. And that's where they experienced forced labour, disease, and just brutal conditions all around. By the time it was all over, an estimated 80% of the Herero population was gone. That's when the Nahmu stepped up. In the end, half of them were killed too. Due to the severity of these events, they were now widely considered the first genocide of the 20th century. Germany would take over 100 years to formally say so, finally acknowledging it in 2021, alongside a €1.1 billion development commitment. But to the Herero and Nahmu leaders, those efforts were not enough, and to this day, they're still fighting for reparations. But history didn't wait. World War I arrived, and South African troops marched in, taking the territory from Germany in 1915. At the time, the Namibians thought that things were going to get better. After all, a new form of leadership was starting, right? But turns out the League of Nations handed South Africa a mandate to govern the territory. And that mandate? Well, it was actually just a cover for apartheid, which meant the land was locked behind white ownership and black Namibians were confined to homelands. It reached a point where a tiny minority controlled almost the entire country's wealth. Faced with such inequality, it's no surprise that resistance happened. So in 1960, a liberation movement was born. Remember this name, SWAPO, or the Southwest Africa People's Organization. 6 years later, with the petitions to the UN going nowhere, they decided to launch an armed struggle. The result? A war that dragged on for decades. Eventually, the UN recognised SWAPO as the sole legitimate representative of the Namibian people. At the same time, the international pressure was mounting. The cost of occupation kept climbing. And by the late 1980s, South Africa was spending close to $1 billion a year just to hold on. Fortunately, the turning point came in 1988, when South African forces suffered a significant defeat in Angola. Suddenly, the negotiating tables looked a lot more attractive. So on March 21st, 1990, the South African flag went down, Namibia's flag went up. And Sam Nujoma, the man who'd spent decades leading the liberation movement, became the country's first president. Interestingly, on the same date, 35 years later, nandi-ndaitwah was inaugurated as Namibia's first female president. But that's a story for another time. Because now it's time to look at the sheer scale of the stage where this new chapter is unfolding. Don't you think? Namibia sits on the southwestern coast of Africa, roughly the size of Spain and Germany combined. The population? About 3 million people, spread across 824,000 square kilometres, or about 318,000 square miles. That makes it the second least densely populated country on Earth, right after Mongolia. So much so that you could probably drive for hours and see nobody. Just the sky, sand, and a whole lot of silence. But that doesn't mean Namibia's empty. Far from it, actually. Because the country breaks down into 5 main regions. Okay, let's start at the coast. This is called the Namib Desert. And it isn't just any desert. It's between 55 and 80 million years old, making it the oldest desert on the planet. It also stretches the entire length of the coastline. And I know what you're thinking. If that's the case, it must be packing some gnarly sand dunes. Which would be correct. Actually, there's one called Big Daddy near Sossusvlei that rises about 325 metres, or over 1,000 feet. It's burnt orange at sunrise, and when you see it up close, it looks absolutely unreal. Then up north, you'll find the Skeleton Coast. Already that should clue you in on what you'll find here. It's named after the whale bones and shipwrecks that litter the beaches that were dragged in by the thick Atlantic fog. Despite that eerie origin story, somehow it's also home to hundreds of thousands of Cape Fur seals, desert lions, and elephants that learn to survive without rivers. As you close in on Namibia, you'll no doubt hit the Central Plateau. This is where the capital, Windhoek, sits, along with savanna, mountains, and the occasional hot spring. Down south, the plateau cracks open into the Fish River Canyon. It's apparently the largest canyon in Africa. Then in the east, that's where the Kalahari is located. I've mentioned Kalahari before, so you know what happened there. But you might not know what it looks like now. Well, just picture ancient red dunes and sparse trees. But if we're being technical about it, it's a fossil desert, because it supports a surprising amount of life. But moving on, tucked in the far northeast is the Caprivi Strip. This is a narrow strip of land reaching toward the Zambezi River. It's lush, green, almost tropical. Almost like Namibia snuck a rainforest in when nobody was looking. So there you have it. 5 regions, 1 country, 0 boring landscapes. It's an adventure waiting to happen, and it's a good thing I got you covered. Scroll down the description, and you'll find the best flights and accommodation deals. And speaking of deals, here's one for you. What if I ask you not to skip this section, and I'll prove to you that it'll be worth your time? Sound good? Yes? Well, let's get started. And there's no place to do so than by looking at literally what's under your feet. That's right, I'm talking about the ground, or rather what's underneath it. So the coastal desert in Namibia is basically a diamond field. Gem-quality diamonds have been washing down the Orange River and settling along the ocean floor for millions of years. And they're not your average diamonds, okay? Because while most countries produce diamonds from $8 to $300 per carat, Namibian diamonds average around $805 per carat. That's more than 5 times the global average. Then there's uranium, with nuclear energy making a comeback in global climate conversations. This element matters now more than ever. Why? Because Namibia is one of the top 3 producers in the world, and one of its mines, Husab, is among the largest open-pit uranium operations in the world. So the next time you hear Japan, China or Europe talk about nuclear power, keep in mind that a part of that conversation runs directly through Namibian soil. Now add gold, silver, zinc, copper and lithium to the list, and you should start to grasp why the colonial powers fought so hard to hold on to this place. But wait, the plot thickens. Because all that underground wealth? Yeah, that doesn't automatically show up in people's bank accounts. Again, why? Well, simply put, Namibia has one of the highest income inequality rates worldwide, plus official unemployment sits at 37%. But analysts say the real rate is over 54% if you include those who have simply given up. Think about that for a second. More than half of Namibia's workforce can't find work. And in a country sitting on diamonds and uranium, that creates a huge gap, which then creates the tension Namibia's economy is facing right now. So where does 2026 stand? At the moment, growth is pretty modest, at around 1.7 to 3.5%, partly because global diamond demand has dropped, partly because a brutal 2024 drought wiped out livestock that are still being rebuilt. I mean, the government's even carrying significant debt and is under pressure to tighten spending without choking development right now. And upon seeing that, the IMF came through in March 2026 and basically said, good foundations, but the work is far from done. We'll take it as a compliment, because as it stands, the bright spots are real. Uranium and gold are performing well, tourism is growing, and then the big wildcard is entering the picture. Oil. Recent offshore discoveries could hold billions of barrels. In fact, the first production is targeted for 2030. If it pushes through, it won't just improve the budget, it will potentially transform the entire economy. And apparently the government is feeling positive about it, because they're already drafting a sovereign wealth fund to make sure the money is managed responsibly. They're not taking any chances anymore, which makes total sense when you understand who this is for, the people. So let's meet them, shall we? Start with the San or Bushmen, the oldest culture in this entire story. We didn't really meet them after the other groups entered the picture. But rest assured, they're still here. They're still tracking animals across the same sand their ancestors crossed. Still reading the desert like a language most of us will never speak. Then there's the Herero women. Trust me, you won't miss them when you walk down the street of Windhoek. They're the ones wearing those enormous, brightly coloured Victorian-style dresses. Plus those long, structured, with horn-shaped headdresses, also called otikaiva. And if you think that style looks a little familiar, that's because it came from German and European missionaries during colonization. Technically, it was imposed, but the Herero looked at it, took it, and turned it into the most recognizable symbol of their identity and pride. Next are the Himba in the northwest. To this day, they're still coating their skin in otizi, which is that deep red mixture of ochre and butterfat. They're still moving with their cattle across the Kunene region, still choosing a way of life that modernity keeps trying to replace. And did you know, they actually petitioned the UN to protect their land? Well, as of 2026, the project has faced massive delays due to protests and environmental concerns. So, the government hasn't pulled the plug just yet, but thanks to that global pressure, the Himbu have forced them to be way more transparent. Then, of course, we can't forget about the Over-Humbo. They make up almost half the population, and they gave this country its liberation movement and its first president. Now, we know what happened next. The Germans and the South Africans arrived, bringing a massive wave of outside influence. But how does a country actually live with that kind of history? Well, let me tell you a story. A traveller once asked a local in Swakopmund what it's really like to be Namibian, especially when you're surrounded by the architecture and the laws of the people who once occupied the land. Funnily enough, he didn't talk about politics or borders. He talked about peace. He mentioned how much more stable and safe he feels here compared to the neighbours, and how the different cultures in Namibia actually collaborate instead of just clashing. And he explained what that was like in a very specific way. He said, "What's in the past is left in the past. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but definitely carried differently." And that basically sums up Namibian culture. Can you think of another culture that did the same thing? I'm genuinely curious, so let me know down below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.